My girlfriend threw a party I never wanted and insulted my disabled mom. Now she's gone, and I'm left heartbroken. I never imagined my life could twist and turn into something so complicated and emotionally charged. It's strange how a single birthday celebration can trigger a chain reaction that unravels so much of the life you've built. When I think about how everything started, it feels almost surreal. Like I blinked and went from content to exhausted, from quietly happy to full-blown heartbroken. I guess I need to go back to the beginning and explain how I ended up here, with a broken forearm, the remnants of a fancy lemon cake rotting in the fridge, and my girlfriend's, or ex-girlfriend's, belongings packed away, waiting for her family to pick them up. I met my girlfriend nearly 3 years ago. We were both finishing up college, and we met at a small local concert where we realized we had all these random things in common: a love for alternative music, a preference for hot tea over coffee, a passion for baking, although she was always far better at it than I was, and a shared hatred of super crowded restaurants. At first, it felt like a match made in heaven. She was funny. She was caring, at least back then. And even when we disagreed on something, we could talk through it pretty calmly. It never got dramatic. I would watch couples around us fight over trivial issues, and I felt lucky that somehow we managed to avoid them. For a while, it was easy. It was comfortable. It was nice. But there was something looming over us from the beginning: my relationship with my mom. She had me when she was just 13. 13. Sometimes I look at pictures of her from when I was a toddler, and she barely looks like an older sister to me, let alone a parent. Growing up, it was difficult to define who was truly in charge in our household. She was physically an adult at some point, but mentally stayed very youthful. I've never had her formally diagnosed because she's extremely sensitive about seeing doctors, especially regarding psychological evaluations, and her own upbringing was so rough that she never got the help she may have needed. My mom's caretakers and older relatives always referred to her as simple or slow. I hate those words, but I don't have a better term that she'd accept. As far as I can tell, she has some developmental delays and limited emotional maturity. That doesn't mean she's not bright in her own ways. She's just different. One of the reasons I feel so protective of her is because she's had a tough life. People bullied her, dismissed her, or treated her like an eternal child. That meant I stepped up to take care of her financially as soon as I got my first real job. She raised me, did her best even though she was so young, and I've always felt it was my duty and my honor to ensure she could live a comfortable life now that I'm an adult and have a decent job. So I decided to pay for her to live in this really nice facility-based community. It's expensive, but it allows her some measure of independence. There's staff around if she gets overwhelmed, and there are activities for her. She has her own small living space, and I help with the bills. It was something that felt right from day one, because it allowed her to have a bit of freedom without risking her welfare. My girlfriend, however, found this problematic. She'd complain that the facility was too costly. She'd say I should just have my mom move in with us in a smaller apartment, or perhaps put her in a cheaper facility so we could start saving up for our future. She wanted a big house someday. She wanted financial security. She wanted the flexibility to travel. And to her, my expenditures on my mother were a roadblock. And perhaps the biggest point of tension, she wanted me to pay for her health insurance. She was on a health plan she couldn't afford, and she knew I had enough money to cover it. But that didn't sit right with me. I love my girlfriend, but she's not my wife, and I felt weird about committing to cover her medical costs, especially when we had never really merged our finances in any legal or formal sense. Call me old-fashioned, but I believe that kind of responsibility should come after marriage, or at least an engagement that we both agree to. And yet, ironically, I did propose to her. Twice, in fact, but each time she turned me down. There was always an excuse, always a reason. She wasn't ready for marriage, or she worried about my mom's bad genes, her words, which cut deeper than she realized. The idea that she felt my mother's disability could be passed down, and that this was a reason to reject my proposals, stung. It left me unsure of where we truly stood. I tried not to let that overshadow the daily rhythm of our relationship. I compartmentalized it. We still spent time cooking together. We still cuddled on the couch and watched shows. We still had weekends where we'd drive out to see the mountains or feed ducks at the local pond. On a good day, I could fool myself into thinking we were closer than ever. Then there were days that reminded me of this rift. Her side comments about how my mother lacked basic manners, or that she was rude in public. It's not that my mom intentionally insults people. She just doesn't always understand social cues. She'll sometimes stare at strangers or interrupt them mid-sentence because she can't regulate the flow of conversation. And sometimes, yes, she'll point out something about a person's appearance that most of us would keep to ourselves. But she never does it to be malicious. She's just honest in a childlike way. My girlfriend always hated that. She'd call her weird or embarrassing, and she never seemed to have empathy for the fact that this was literally how my mom's mind. Still, I figured we could handle our differences with open communication. I never guessed it would all come crashing down over a single birthday celebration. This year, my birthday rolled around, and my girlfriend said she wanted to bake me a cake. She's amazing at baking. One of the best bakers I know, honestly. Beautiful decorations, fancy piping, multi-layer cakes with elaborate fillings, all that. But I told her quite plainly that I just wanted a simple chocolate sheet cake with canned frosting and rainbow sprinkles. Exactly the way my mom had made it for me every single birthday growing up. It was comfort food. It was nostalgia. And since my mom wasn't able to make it this year, I wanted to keep the tradition alive. I also said I didn't want a big party. All I wanted was a quiet day. Maybe just the two of us or a small gathering with immediate family. She tried convincing me to do something more sophisticated. Maybe a gourmet cake with fancy ingredients. She pointed out that a box cake mix was cheap, and I deserved something better. I insisted, no. I wanted the sheet cake, the canned frosting, the sprinkles, and I didn't want any big presents either. I just wanted a no-stress day. But that's not what happened. The morning of my birthday, she claimed the dining room and kitchen were a mess. So she served me breakfast in the living room and kept ushering me away from entering the kitchen all day. I figured maybe she was preparing a surprise, but I kept reminding her I didn't want a party. I told her, if you want to do something small, invite your parents, maybe mine, but please don't throw a big event. She just patted my shoulder, smiled, and changed the subject. After lunch, she shooed me out of the house for about an hour, telling me she needed some final preparation time. So I obliged, wandering around a nearby park. I remember feeling an odd sense of unease, like I just knew she was planning a big social gathering. I considered texting her, reminding her that I really didn't want that, but I decided not to. I told myself maybe she was just decorating, or maybe she was surprising me in a sweet, private way. But when I came home, I opened the front, and about 30 people jumped out from behind furniture, blowing those noisy party horns. "Surprise!" they all yelled. I almost dropped my keys. It was like a who's who of everyone I'd ever met. Coworkers, neighbors, old classmates, people I barely even knew beyond an occasional text or the handful of times we hung out in a group. I felt overwhelmed. I'm not a big party person in the first place, and to be honest, I started feeling nauseous. I tried my best to plaster on a smile because I knew they meant well, but it was the opposite of what I had requested. If it had just been our families or maybe a small handful of close friends, I might have been able to adapt, but this was like a house full of chaos. Worse, I scanned the crowd and realized my mom wasn't there. My girlfriend's parents were there, but my mother wasn't. I felt a little pang in my chest. She would have found this party overwhelming, but at least invite her. Give her the choice to come or not. The entire atmosphere was suffocating. Then I saw the cake. It was absolutely gorgeous, towering with 3 tiers, lemon creme flavored with edible flowers and fresh berries. It looked like something you'd see on a high-end wedding Pinterest. Everyone was marveling at it, telling my girlfriend how talented she was, how she should open a bakery. And sure, it was remarkable. But it was not the chocolate sheet cake with canned frosting and rainbow sprinkles that I'd specifically asked for. Lemon cake isn't even a flavor I'm particularly fond of. I felt deflated because I realized that she'd completely ignored my wishes, as though she was convinced I didn't really want what I had requested. The party went on. I tried to make conversation with guests, but I wasn't in the mood to socialize, and I wasn't prepared mentally for a big crowd. People started handing me presents, and I appreciated the thought, but I felt awkward. I didn't want gifts. I'd specifically said no presents. Now I had to open them while everyone stared at me, waiting for my reaction. I felt like I was stuck in a performance. "Oh, wow, thank you so much," over and over, even though I was genuinely uncomfortable. Meanwhile, I kept noticing my girlfriend beaming with pride every time someone complimented the decorations or the fancy cake. Whenever I seemed a little subdued, she'd shoot me this look, like I was being ungrateful. I tried to rally, tried to force a bigger smile, but it never felt genuine. When we finally cut the cake, she sliced me a large piece and encouraged me to take a bite. I took a few bites. It was actually delicious. No surprise there. But the taste was overshadowed by how uneasy I felt. My stomach was in knots from the stress. I set the plate down and mumbled something about being too full. She took it as a personal insult in front of everyone. I guess it was pretty blunt of me, but I didn't have the emotional wherewithal at that moment to put on an act. I hoped the day would wrap up soon. After an hour, most people had finished their cake, and that's when my mom arrived, nearly 2 hours late. As soon as she walked in, she was wide-eyed, seeing the aftermath of this big party. My girlfriend looked taken aback and whispered to me that she must have given my mom the wrong time by accident. I felt a spike of anger. How could she forget to tell my mom the correct start time for my birthday party? My mom tottered in, carrying a small gift bag and a single cupcake in a plastic container. It was a homemade chocolate cupcake with canned frosting and rainbow sprinkles. It might have looked amateur next to the extravagant lemon tower, but in my eyes, it was perfect. She handed me the cupcake, explaining she couldn't make the whole cake like usual this year, but wanted to keep the tradition in some small way. I felt my throat tighten with emotion because I could see she'd tried so hard to replicate the yearly tradition despite her circumstances. I didn't hide my gratitude or my excitement. I hugged her and thanked her, and I was genuinely touched. That's when I noticed my girlfriend glaring at us from the side. She had that look on her face, annoyed, even resentful. Then, to my shock, she made a joke about the cupcake's appearance being unique, just like my mom. She said something about how it looked like a toddler had made it, then made a backhanded comment about how the frosting job matched my mom's pigtails and colorful clothing style. A few people laughed awkwardly, probably out of discomfort. My mom didn't even register the insult, but I sure did. It felt cruel. After most guests left, I tried to find a small corner in the house to breathe. Eventually, the day wound down, and I ended up in bed later that night, eating the little cupcake my mom gave me. That cupcake was the only bright spot in what had otherwise been an overwhelming and disappointing day. My girlfriend walked in and saw me happily devouring it. She muttered under her breath that of course I'd rather eat something that looks like it was made by a toddler than her actual quality dessert. That was the final straw. I lost my temper. We argued for nearly an hour, voices raised to a level that would have horrified the neighbors if they were still around. I pointed out how she'd disrespected my mom, how she completely ignored my preferences for my birthday, how she'd orchestrated a party I explicitly didn't want, and how she made hurtful comments. She argued back that she was just trying to give me a special celebration because I deserved more than a cheap box cake. She said she was sick of tiptoeing around my mom's behavior, that she was uncomfortable with how much money I spent on. Before I knew it, I was so full of anger and sadness that I grabbed a blanket off the bed and went to sleep on the couch. On my own birthday. The next day, the tension persisted. She refused to apologize, and I told her I wasn't going to eat any of her desserts or any meals she cooked until she apologized for what she'd said about my mother. She then told everyone, her family, friends, and even some of mine, that I hated the party. So I started getting calls and texts about how ungrateful I was, how she'd worked so hard on this special event, and how I was failing to appreciate her efforts. Worse, she kept bringing up how I refused to pay for her insurance, using that as an example of how I was stingy or uncommitted. Our arguments escalated. Her parents, who used to seem pretty fond of me, now seemed outraged. They couldn't believe I could be so dismissive of their daughter's efforts and so willing to waste money on my mom, but not on her medical insurance. I felt cornered in my own home, as if I had nowhere to turn without being cast as the villain. That's when other private matters started leaking out. I had confided in my girlfriend about certain things I'd done before we met, things I deeply regretted. I had a period where I was desperate for money, and I'd done some shady stuff. I didn't want details to get out to anyone, because while the statute of limitations would protect me legally at this point, socially it could destroy my reputation. And I guess I'd also done a brief stint doing adult videos. That was not exactly my proudest moment, but it saved me from absolute poverty. Now she was threatening to let that slip to people if we had another big fight. I felt manipulated and scared. I was also furious that she would dangle that over my head. It was blackmail in spirit, if not in name. At the same time, I still felt torn because I loved her. Or at least, I loved the person I thought she was at the beginning of our relationship. I remembered the nights we spent laughing at silly movies, the gentle kisses in the early morning hours, the way she'd once pinned a flower in my hair and said it made me look soft. But I also kept thinking about those 2 rejected marriage proposals. Each time she said no, it was always about my mom's bad genes, or how she wasn't sure if she wanted to deal with a mother-in-law who could potentially pass on disabilities if we had children. It stung. Maybe if I had no desire for kids, it wouldn't have mattered. But I do want a child. At least one. Deep down, I always hoped that my mom's condition wouldn't pass on. I myself have no disabilities. But my girlfriend felt it was too big a gamble. The more I mulled it over, the more I questioned why I was staying in this relationship. So one day, I took the coward's way out. I wrote a breakup note, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her lunch bag before I left for work. I left the house super early so I wouldn't have to face her. All I could think was that when she found it, she'd either blow up my phone with angry texts or cry or do something, but I didn't want to witness it. The entire day at work, I was a nervous wreck, checking my phone constantly. She didn't text or call me once, which almost felt worse than what I'd expected. When I finally mustered the courage to come home, I found her waiting in the living room. She said she wanted to talk things over calmly. My heart pounded, because some small part of me hoped we could reconcile. But as soon as we started talking, Everything went downhill. Her eyes narrowed. Her voice trembled with anger. And she told me how pathetic I was for leaving a note, how her coworker had seen her reading it and was horrified on her behalf. She then went on a tirade about how I never appreciated what she did for me, about how humiliating it was that she baked a grand cake for someone who clearly didn't deserve it. I tried to explain my side calmly at first, but my voice rose when she brought up my mom again, complaining that I'd lost sight of real priorities. We ended up shouting at each other, voices echoing off the walls. She called me a mama's boy who was throwing away a chance at a real family. I retorted that I was sick of her cruelty and that she owed my mom an apology she'd never give. At some point, I got so upset that I tried to walk away, but she started throwing things. Small items at first, then heavier objects. One of them, a glass paperweight, hit the floor near my feet and shattered. I slipped on a piece of it while turning around to avoid the next projectile, lost my balance, and crashed down on my arm in a very bad angle. The pain was immediate and excruciating. I heard a crack that made my stomach churn. My forearm felt like it was on fire, and I started screaming. She froze, her anger seeming to dissipate in an instant, replaced by horror. She rushed over to me, apologized frantically, helped me stand, but my arm was throbbing. My vision was fuzzy with tears, partly from the pain, partly from the emotional overload. She drove me to the ER. That ride felt like the longest half hour of my life. I was cradling my broken arm, tears streaming down my face, and she was muttering apologies under her breath. My mind was spinning in circles. How had we gone from normal banter to screaming and broken bones? My heart felt shattered, not just my forearm. When we got to the hospital, nurses swarmed around me with questions. They asked what had happened, and we both gave a vague explanation about me slipping at home. I didn't want to blame her in that moment, even though it had been her throwing things that started it all. They took me in, gave me pain medication, and set my arm in a cast. During that process, I passed out or fell asleep from the medication. When I opened my eyes, she was sitting there quietly, looking like she'd been crying. She looked at me and said, "I'm sorry," but she wouldn't hold my hand. I could sense she was still mad, or maybe resentful. She had gotten food for herself and didn't offer me any, which on the surface might seem trivial, but the coldness in her demeanor was impossible to miss. As soon as I was discharged, we climbed back into the car, and she was silent while I stared out the window, my head spinning with painkillers and heartbreak. When we got back home, we argued again, but it was a hollow kind of argument, both of us at the end of our ropes. In a moment of anger, I told her she needed to leave and stay with her sister, who lived an hour away. She stared at me, seething, then abruptly agreed, saying she couldn't stand being under the same roof with me either. She started packing her stuff, but only half-heartedly. Then she said her parents would come pick up the rest in 3 days, so I needed to have it ready. I watched her go. I just sat there in the living room, my arm in a sling, pain radiating from my forearm, feeling completely hollow. The next day, I woke up to find she'd only posted a couple of vague messages on social media about how some men can't handle a strong woman, and that she was done with negativity. Not exactly a smear campaign, but enough for some mutual friends to get the hint. I started receiving texts from her close friends, either berating me or blocking me. My own friends, the ones who knew me well, reached out to see if I was okay, but I felt too exhausted to talk about it. I deleted social media off my phone for a while. I couldn't stomach the drama. Her parents left me a voicemail, her mother crying, saying how disappointed they were in me. I imagined they only knew her side of the story, a version where I was an uncaring partner who let her plan a party that I hated, who refused to pay for her insurance while dropping thousands on my crazy mom, and apparently I'd broken their daughter's heart by ending things. Some part of me wanted to defend myself, but a bigger part of me just felt too tired to bother. I didn't want to see them or have another confrontation. I figured I'd pack up her stuff, let them come, and let them go. No words, no arguments. In the meantime, I avoided telling my mom any details about what happened. She'd call me every day, cheerful as always, wanting to chat about silly things. She told me about a new friend she made at the facility, someone who also liked to color in those adult coloring books with birds and flowers. My mom is so innocent in many ways, blissfully unaware of the ways people can be cruel. The last thing I wanted was for her to know my girlfriend had ridiculed or that she'd stormed out, leaving me in a swirl of pain and confusion. I tried to keep my voice steady on the phone, not letting on how miserable I felt. I told her my arm was in a cast because I slipped, but that I'd be fine. She just said, "Be careful, honey," the same way a parent would. Then she launched into how she was craving chocolate cupcakes again, which made me smile despite everything. After the breakup, the house felt bizarrely quiet. The lemon cake in the fridge stayed there, untouched. I'd open the fridge to grab something, see the cake container, and lose my appetite. Just looking at it made me remember the fiasco of my birthday, how a day that should have been simple and comforting turned into chaos. Sometimes I'd stand there, my forehead against the fridge door, telling myself not to break down. But eventually, I just couldn't handle it. I chucked the entire cake into the trash. Maybe that was petty, but the sight of it caused a twinge of anger and sadness every time I saw it. While packing my girlfriend's, no, my ex-girlfriend's, clothes and personal items, I came across the ring I'd bought for one of our proposals. That glimmering piece of jewelry felt like a cruel reminder of how hopeful I'd been about our future not that long ago. I remembered rehearsing my proposals. I remembered how my heart pounded when I asked her to marry me. I remembered the twist of pain in my chest when she turned me down, citing fears about our genetic future. Now, holding that ring in my hand felt humiliating. I wasn't sure if I should throw it in with the rest of her things or keep it somewhere out of sight, maybe to pawn later. My indecision about such a small object symbolized the entire swirl of confusion I was stuck in, wanting closure, but still feeling the lingering threads of heartbreak. I thought about texting her to see if she was okay or if maybe, just maybe, we could fix things. But then I'd remember all the resentment she harbored toward my mom, all the manipulative threats, that awful joke about my cupcake, and the derisive comments about bad genes. I'd remember the shattered glass on the floor, the sickening snap of my arm as I fell. And I realized that some things can't be mended. Maybe we had some good times in the past, but that didn't excuse the cruelty. It didn't excuse the refusal to respect my simple birthday wish, or the mockery of my mother's innocent gestures. So I told myself I'd stay strong. I'd let her parents come, collect her belongings, and leave. I'd avoid any lengthy conversation with them because I was done with the drama. I spent those 3 days cleaning the house in a numb, mechanical way. I'd stop occasionally because my arm hurt if I moved it too much, but I also didn't want to just lie in bed feeling sorry for myself. The main issue was the mental anguish. Sleeping was hard. My mind replayed the fights, the party, the looks of pity or shock from friends. Occasionally, I'd wake up thinking she was still next to me, and when I remembered she was gone, I'd feel this pang of loneliness. A couple of nights, I just cried quietly into my pillow, as much out of confusion as sadness. On the day her parents were supposed to arrive, I lined up all the boxes neatly in the living room. There were about 6 boxes, one full of her clothes, one of her books, another of random trinkets, her favorite pillows, and so on. I'd tossed in the ring box at the last minute, deciding I didn't want it in my possession anymore. My arm throbbed under its cast, so I settled onto the couch, waiting. They arrived around noon, her mother's eyes red and puffy, her father stone-faced. They barely said a word. Her father nodded at me curtly, then started lugging boxes out to the car. Her mother gave me one sad glance and asked if I had anything to say. For a moment, I considered explaining everything, but I just said, "I'm sorry this happened. Please take care of her." She nodded, tears still in her eyes, and she left. That was it. 3 years of a relationship, gone in a matter of minutes with no real closure, except a pile of boxes and a heartbreak that felt too big to name. After they drove away, I locked the door and stood there in silence. Part of me wanted to collapse on the floor. Another part felt a strange relief, like 100 pounds had lifted off my shoulders. I texted my closest friend, letting him know it was done, that she'd come for her things. He responded with a simple, "I'm here if you need anything, man." I stared at his message until my eyes burned. Then I decided I needed fresh air. I drove carefully, my arm in a cast made it tricky, to a small nature trail near town. I walked slowly, ignoring the twinges of pain each time I jostled my forearm, focusing on the crunch of leaves under my feet, the smell of pine in the air, the mild warmth of the afternoon sun. It was oddly soothing. My mind drifted to the happy memories I had with her, and I felt tears pricking my eyes again. But I also remembered all the times she belittled my mom, all the times she tried to push me into a mold I wasn't comfortable, like paying for her insurance, like ignoring my mother's needs, like prioritizing a future dream house over present responsibilities. I realized how incompatible we truly were. I realized how alone I'd felt in that final year of our relationship, constantly trying to bridge a gap that kept widening. By the time I got back to my house, I felt calmer, albeit exhausted. The next few days were uneventful. I called my mom and told her I'd ended things with my girlfriend. She gasped and asked what happened, worried about me. I gave her a vague explanation, saying we had disagreements we couldn't work out. She offered to come over and help me with my arm, but I told her I'd be okay, that we should just meet in a few days for lunch. I didn't want to disrupt her routine or upset her more than necessary. She said she understood and reminded me to look both ways before crossing the street, a gentle motherly caution that made me chuckle. It was always little phrases like that which revealed she still saw me as a kid, even though I was the one taking care of her financially. I let her words warm my heart. In the evenings, I'd poke around my kitchen, trying to make simple meals that wouldn't strain my injured arm. My mind roamed to random places, like how, for my next birthday, I might try to bake my own chocolate sheet cake. Maybe I'd do it with my mom, fulfilling that tradition even better. I missed that basic, nostalgic flavor. The rainbow sprinkles, the sweet canned frosting that always tasted like home. I thought about how the fancy lemon cake, though beautiful, was a symbol of a relationship where my partner never truly listened to me. Something about that observation gave me a sense of closure. I resolved that it was time to take a break from dating entirely. I needed space to heal physically and emotionally. My forearm would take some time, and physical therapy would come later to strengthen it. My heart, though, might take longer. I scrolled through old photos on my phone, pictures of us at the beach, at that local concert where we first met, at a small cafe where she taught me how to do fancy cake piping. There was a pang of nostalgia, but also a realization. Those moments were real, but so was the fundamental mismatch in our values and compassion. I left the photos there. I didn't have the energy to delete them, and maybe I never would. They'd just be a snapshot of a past self, a memory of who I was before this final blow-up. Eventually, life started to regain a semblance of normalcy. I went back to work, fielding concerned questions about my cast. I gave vague answers, not wanting to delve into personal drama. Some people pried, hinting that they knew something about a breakup, but I brushed them off politely. The rumor mill might churn, but I wasn't interested in adding fuel. I did notice that a few coworkers who were her friends started avoiding me in the break room. I let them. It was probably for the best. They'd made their judgment based on her account, and I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to defend myself or rehash the story. At night, I'd sometimes dream about the fight, the crash to the floor, the pain in my own, and I'd wake up panicked, drenched in sweat. But as the days turned into weeks, that vivid fear began to fade. The cast remained, but the emotional bruises slowly started to heal. I reflected on the lessons I learned, that ignoring red flags about how someone treats your loved ones can lead to bigger cracks in the relationship. That you can't force someone to value what's important to you. That people who belittle someone with a disability, especially your own mother, are not people you should spend your life with, no matter how beautiful their smile or how skillful their baking might be. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the breakup, I decided to drive out to the facility where my mom lived so we could have lunch together. She greeted me with her usual enthusiastic hug, and we went to a small cafe nearby. She was in a bright pink dress, her hair in 2 ponytails as she often wore it. She'd even added little ribbons to the tails. I found it endearing. Over sandwiches and soft drinks, she said something that almost brought me to tears. "I'm sorry you're sad, but I still love you all the time." I blinked, stunned. She's not always aware of the nuance of everything that happens, but she picks up on emotions. I asked if she was upset that my girlfriend wasn't around anymore. She tilted her head, thinking. Then she said, "I want you to be happy." Was she making you happy? I couldn't speak for a moment. "Finally," I told her. "Not anymore." She nodded and reached across the table to pat my hand. In that gesture, I felt more understanding and compassion than I'd felt in months with my ex. My mother might not always comprehend every complex situation, but she knows love at a fundamental level. We finished our meal, and we went back to her apartment so I could see her new coloring books. I flipped through pictures of birds, flowers, geometric patterns that she'd begun to fill in with bright crayons. She insisted I color a page with her, so I sat there, awkwardly using my left hand to shade in the lines while my casted right arm rested in my lap. She giggled at how sloppy my left-handed coloring was. Still, that half hour felt so peaceful, so real. No judgments, no expectations, just 2 people sharing a moment. On my drive home, I felt a lot lighter. I realized that I'd made the right decision to end things. Maybe it had been a messy, impulsive, and painful breakup, but it was the right choice nonetheless. The best indicator was how much calmer I felt now that she was gone. Sure, I still had moments of heartbreak, but it was heartbreak I could move on from, not the daily stress of trying to reconcile irreconcilable differences. Another week later, the cast on my arm was replaced with a more lightweight one, and I managed to return to a more normal routine at work. Life was continuing forward, like it or not. One evening, while rummaging through some old boxes in my closet, I found a tiny set of sprinkles and a container of chocolate frosting left over from who knows when. It made me smile. I thought about how next year, or maybe sooner, I might try to bake a small cake, like the one my mom always made for my birthday, just for myself, for the fun of it. A comforting reminder that life can be sweet in the simplest ways. Occasionally, I'd get random messages from mutual friends who had questions or wanted gossip, and I either politely told them I wasn't comfortable talking about it or simply didn't respond. One friend told me my ex was subtly posting cryptic messages, but from what I gathered, she wasn't fully outing any of my past mistakes. I felt a surge of relief but also anger that I'd worried so much about that. Maybe she wanted to keep the moral high ground. Maybe she realized that if she tried to drag my name through the mud, I had dirt on her as well. It didn't matter. I was just grateful not to be dealing with that battle on top of everything else. Some nights, I did feel a longing for companionship. I missed having someone to curl up with on the couch, missed the warmth of another person in my bed, missed the sense of partnership, but I knew it wasn't her I missed exactly. It was the idea of being in a healthy, loving relationship, something that, unfortunately, wasn't our reality. So I let the loneliness wash over me, and I coped with it. I called my mom more often. I watched dumb comedy specials. I did a little journaling to untangle my thoughts. I reminded myself that heartbreak is a process, and I tried to have patience with my own healing. Eventually, I took the big step of setting up an appointment to speak with a therapist. I realized how emotionally drained I was, how battered my self-esteem had become. The session was eye-opening. We talked about boundaries, about how important it is to stand firm in what you need out of a partnership, about the guilt I felt for not paying for her insurance and whether that guilt was actually warranted. The therapist validated that it was okay to prioritize my mother's welfare and to not feel obligated to cover someone else's medical expenses, especially when we weren't married or engaged. She also helped me see how manipulative my ex's behavior had been at times. It was a relief to hear that my instincts weren't just illusions. In the following sessions, we delved deeper into my fears about children possibly inheriting my mom's condition and whether that fear played any role in my love life. We talked about how I could handle future relationships, like being upfront about my priorities and my mother's place in my life from day one. It was liberating, and I felt hope creeping back into my chest. Not a wild, romantic kind of hope, but a gentle acceptance that I could find someone someday who would love me and also accept my mom without judgment. One rainy afternoon, a couple months later, I visited my mom again. We ended up in her little kitchen, and for fun, we baked a small batch of chocolate cupcakes, the same style she used to make for my birthdays. The smell of chocolate filled the apartment, and we smothered them in that super sweet canned frosting she adored. Rainbow sprinkles went everywhere, and as I bit into the cupcake still warm from the oven, something inside me felt like it was healing. This was what I'd wanted on my birthday. A simple gesture, a piece of my childhood, shared with a person who had given me what love she could. It tasted perfect, like nostalgia, comfort, and unconditional acceptance all at once. I'm not sure where life will take me now. I still have moments when I ache for the relationship I thought I had, but I'm learning that sometimes heartbreak is necessary. Sometimes you walk away from someone not because you didn't love each other at some point, but because the way they treat your family or your fundamental values just can't be reconciled. I learned that ignoring your own boundaries can lead to deep resentment on both sides. And I learned that, at least for me, caring for my mom is non-negotiable. If a future partner can't respect that, we'll never make it for the long haul. My arm is healing, slowly but surely. My heart, too, is on the mend. And as for my ex-girlfriend, I wish her well, truly. I hope she finds someone who aligns with her financial goals and her lifestyle preferences. I hope she learns to be more empathetic toward people with disabilities. But I no longer see myself as responsible for guiding her to that growth. We're done, and that door is closed. If there's a lesson in all of this, maybe it's that you can't force someone to see your perspective, especially when it involves caring for someone they deem unworthy or inconvenient. Perhaps it's also that parties and presents mean nothing if they don't come with genuine respect for the person you're celebrating. And I guess that's the heart of it. No matter how fancy the cake, if it's baked without understanding and empathy, it's just sugar on the outside of a hollow situation. I won't lie and say I'm fully over it, or that I don't have days where I doubt myself or wonder if I should have tried harder to fix things. But when I speak to my mom and hear her sweet, unfiltered laughter, I'm reminded that protecting her from ridicule is the right thing to do. She deserves kindness, as do I. Maybe one day I'll find that with someone else, someone who sees the beauty in a simple cupcake or a box mix cake, someone who respects the money I spend to give my mom a safe, independent life. And if that day comes, I'll be ready to love without reservation, but also with the healthy boundaries I've learned to maintain. For now, I wake up in my quiet house, stare at my cast in the mirror, and remind myself it's temporary. All pain eventually heals. My mother's voice echoes in my mind. Look both ways before crossing the street. Maybe that's a metaphor for my future relationships. I'll look both ways, think about what truly matters, and cross into new possibilities when I feel it's safe and right. And when my next birthday comes around, I'm sure there will be a chocolate sheet cake with canned frosting and rainbow sprinkles, made with simple love and no pretenses. That to me will be the sweetest victory of all.